What is good, everyone? Welcome to another episode of the Terminator Training Show. I am Kevin Smith. Today is going to be a Q&A episode, and this time I am going to try and make the answers a little bit shorter, still provide enough information for you guys to take away some good value from it, but also try and get to more questions. I got quite a few questions, and a lot of them are really good. Oftentimes, some weeks I'll get lots and lots of questions, but they're just, some of them are not great. And of course, there are some that are a little questionable in here, no pun intended, but there are some really good ones. So I'm going to try and get to a lot and see what happens. Of course, no promises. Sometimes I get really into certain answers. If you've been listening for a while, you know that I tend to do that. And I just want to provide as much context as I possibly can, but also not make any single question like half the episode or a quarter of the episode, or make it a full length episode just to answer one question. So that's the goal. I'm going to try and limit myself to a few minutes per answers. Some will be a little shorter, some will be a little longer, and we'll go from there. So without further ado, let's hop right into it with first question. How would you train and program for the long walk? Long walk, for those who are not aware, is Delta Force selection, aka CAG selection. They run 2 per year, one in the fall, one in the spring, in the mountains of West Virginia. And I went and successfully completed the selection in 2018. And I am not going to really talk much about specifics. As you guys know, I never really talk about a lot of specifics for that selection because it is not as well known on open source or as much talked about on open source as SFAS. And out of respect for the unit and its mystique and its prestige, I definitely keep it very vague. However, for training, I definitely can provide some general tips and guidelines, and also talk to you about how I actually have a client going to an upcoming class. And I also have, of course, trained for it myself. This was a little bit before, or well before, I had the expansive fitness knowledge, and especially conditioning knowledge compared to what I have now. But I still knew enough, and I still, of course, did enough things right to go and crush it. So what I would do is consider what most of the selection is. And without getting into too many details, I think most of us know that it's very, very ruck dominant. You're basically going to have a ruck on almost every day, and it is not as well-rounded or multi-dimensional as, say, SFAS. There's no team week. There's no gated runs. You do have to do a PT test on the first day, so you have to run 2 miles at a decent clip. But really, that's it. After that, you're not going to really run unless you're running with your ruck on, which there are cases where that would make sense. Like on the 18-miler on the first day, you're going to want to probably run a good portion of that if you want to finish in a good time. And then, of course, when you're out on the course, you can run if you want, but I don't think it's necessary, especially if you're accurate and you can move pretty quick with your ruck on just at a walking pace. Makes sense to just preserve energy. Of course, when you're around cadre, run, make it look like you're working hard. Or if you get lost and you have to backtrack, then it may be appropriate to run. But aside from that, it's just rucking, and it's just in the mountains. So ideally, you live in a place where you can get to some terrain that is undulating. You don't have to live in the mountains of West Virginia or the mountains of North Carolina or the Rocky Mountains like I did. That was a big advantage, is that I lived in Colorado Springs at the time, but you don't have to. It would be ideal if you could get yourself on some terrain. That changes though. However, I did have several guys from 7th group, and everyone's pretty aware that Florida is very flat. I had several guys from 7th group be successful in my class. It was probably a little hard for them on the mountain days. Not every single day is mountains, but most days are, and they're brutal. And those are the hardest days too. But I would absolutely prioritize rucking for the most part. Of course, you do need to run a little bit unless you're a freak runner and you know for a fact you can crush like a 12:30 or faster 2 mile with very minimal running. But usually I have guys that I'm helping prep for selection run at least twice a week. And this is the last few months. Prior to that, there's a lot more running, and then it kind of switches to more specificity, more rucking. But the last few months before going, usually 2 runs a week, 2 to 3 rucks per week, and those rucks are all different. So ideally you get one like heavier cross country ruck. Ideally you get one moderate load ruck where you're kind of working on your walking pace. And then potentially your longer rucks on some weekends, you might go a little bit faster as if you're practicing or prepping for the gated ruck or the 18 miler that you're going to get timed on. For runs, as you get close, you want to keep it specific. So you don't need a ton of volume. Literally, you just have to run 2 miles pretty fast. So you don't need a shit ton of run volume, but you definitely want to do some repeats. You want to maybe do some short tempos, one or the other, or both. Or you could also just do kind of some easy runs with pickups, easy runs with hills, mix all those types of things in. A big mistake a lot of people make is they do a ton of lifting, and you don't really need to be all that strong. Of course, lifting will help you ruck better. It'll support your rucking, and you should be lifting a little bit. It'll make you more durable, but you don't need to be lifting 4 days a week, 5 days a week, probably even 3 days a week. Usually what I have guys do is 2 full body sessions and 1 calisthenic focused day for the APFT or whatever they do for a fitness test. I'm not sure what it is right now, but when I went, it was the APFT. So push-ups, sit-ups, and a 2 mile. So be sure not to do too much lifting volume and do lifts that fit your frame well, that don't beat you up, that don't interfere with your conditioning, especially your rucking. So exercise selection, exercise execution, doing a reasonable amount of volume, and not training like an idiot is a general recommendation. That way you can have a mindset of whatever I'm doing in the gym should support my rucking ability pretty much. Somewhat running ability, but more so rucking ability and my durability, my ability to continue to put repeated performance up day after day after day without a significant drop off and without injury. Easier said than done, of course. Freak incidents happen. People get injured there all the time just because it's very dangerous. When I was on one of the practical exercise days, I fell off a cliff like probably between 15 and 20 feet. Accidentally, of course. I was coming up to my point and I pretty much was at this very steep drop off and I was pretty much at a point of no return. And I was trying to go someplace where it would be a less of a drop. And I was going to drop my ruck and then kind of like combat roll off the cliff intentionally. And as I was doing that, I slipped and I tried to grab a tree. The tree was not strong enough, pulled the tree out of the ground and fell. Luckily, I fell back down and landed. Literally the only thing that touched the ground was my ruck. So I got really lucky. I did not hurt anything. The cadre, who are very much in role the entire time, they have like a script that they follow. This dude actually asked me if I was okay. So it definitely probably looked a lot worse than it was. And it was pretty scary, but I was totally fine. But that stuff happens all the time and not everyone's as lucky. Some people really hurt themselves. So of course you can't out durability train your propensity to fall off a cliff and potentially break your leg or something like that. But you definitely can make yourself more durable just day after day after day of rucking and continuously being stressed out. You do get pretty good sleep there. You get to bring your own food. They have a really good DFAC. So that's always good. Definitely better fed than SFAS, especially if you're smart with your fueling and you practice it and you bring plenty of it. That is definitely awesome. It kind of gives you the ability to have more of your fate in your own hands. Like I either decided to bring enough food and fuel or I didn't. And I decided to eat enough fuel and continuously remind myself to eat even if I wasn't hungry or I didn't. And a lot of guys don't, believe it or not. When you're tired and you're stressed out and you're not thinking about it, it can be very easy to forget to fuel and therefore fuel insufficiently / hydrate insufficiently. So that is in a nutshell how I would go about it. Of course, I could get way, way, way more specific on how to break those things down, but you should be at least prioritizing rucking, using your lifting to support your conditioning, and doing enough running to do well on the 2 mile run. So best of luck. Next question, does your 19-week hypertrophy program allow for regular running up to 30 miles per week? So it is a hypertrophy focused program and therefore there is no conditioning in it at all programmed. However, you can add some conditioning to it, but always remember that the more conditioning you add, especially running, which is a more recovery demanding conditioning, it's a more stressful version of conditioning than other forms. You just need to remember that that's going to potentially eat into your recovery. You're going to need to recover from your runs. You're also going to need to be recovering from your lifts. And this is a 5-day per week lifting program. So it's pretty high volume compared to some of my other programs because it's a hypertrophy only program. So you need to keep that in mind. If you are trying to get up to 30 miles per week, I would say I would expect you to not get the type of hypertrophy gains that you otherwise could. And that's even if you're very, very dialed in across the board. It's just going to interfere with recovery too much. If you're doing mostly slow runs and you're very, very experienced with running, maybe a different story. Your body's kind of adapted to it. But if you're not experienced with it and you're trying to build your volume up, like say do a base phase while also doing the hypertrophy program, it's usually just not going to be very sustainable or manageable for most people. So if you want to get really good at running and you also want to get strong and jacked, Jack Gazelle and Jack Gazelle version 2 are both the best options for that. Don't get me wrong, you can do a little bit of running during hypertrophy, but it's not programmed in there. And in my experience, most people who try and add their own stuff to already built programs that are meant to be followed on their own usually don't fare as well. So tread carefully. Next question, what is your best overall program? In my opinion, it is Jack Gazelle 2.0, my most recent program, only because I have more programming knowledge and I had more programming knowledge when I built it than any other program. I had more programming experience, and the more you do programming, the better you get at it. The more programs that you see from other people, good or bad, the more you learn what to do, what not to do, so on and so forth. The more mentorship you get, the more clients you program for, the more you run your own experiences. All those types of things will improve your ability to program. That has been my experience over the years. And so therefore, not only is Jack Gazelle 2.0 my most well-rounded program, it's got the most things in it as far as being a well-rounded athlete, mostly strength and muscle building and some endurance, but a little bit of other athletic abilities as well. Power, strongman style training, as well as even some metcons. So you're going to get a good mix of a bunch of different things. And I am very confident in the fact that it is definitely my best program, but it does depend on your goals. So I have programs for lots of different goals. So if your goal is to become a superstar runner in the 2 and 5 mile range, Jack Gazelle version 2 would help. So would Jack Gazelle version 1, but not quite as much as the 2 and 5 mile program. If your goal is to go to SFAS, Jack Gazelle or 2.0 can be great to follow when you're a little further out, but I would follow the SFAS program going in. If your goal is to get jacked, hypertrophy program. So if you're more of a beginner, if you have a basic garage gym setup, but you don't have full access to a ton of equipment, Kickstart would be a good option. If you have 20 minutes to train, 30 minutes to train, and you still want to get it in, then time crunch. So it really depends on the goal, but overall, just knowing what I know about programming, Jack Gazelle 2.0 is by far the most optimal or the best of all of them. Next question, what is your max heart rate? According to my Garmin, it's I think 181 or 182. So yeah, it used to be higher. When you get older, your max heart rate goes down. Not a bad thing, just something to consider. So generally your zones are also going to go down. Usually for my longer zone 2 stuff, I try and stay in the 135 to 140 range. My shorter, easier zone 2 stuff, I usually stay in the 125 to 130, sometimes 135 range for heart rate, and pretty good to go. Most of my tempo runs are 165, 170, once in a while if it's really hot out, maybe a little higher than 170. But rarely do I get up to my max heart rate range or anywhere near it. I don't do a lot of zone 5 training, and that is intentional. I just don't really need a ton of it, and it's very fatiguing. Not to say that it's bad, but for my goals, running an ultra, not a lot of work is going to be done in zone 5. So I stick to mostly zone 2, a little bit of zone 3, decent amount of zone 4. I'll do speed work and tempo work that brings me into zone 4, hills, and so on and so forth, but mostly stay around those areas. And yeah, I would say probably in the 180 range would be a good estimate for my max heart rate. Next question, is it normal for your knees to pop when doing squats? I just started and it is happening. Yeah, it's totally normal. Anytime I do a squat, especially if I haven't squatted yet that day, like if I were to drop into a squat right now, my knees would pop like popcorn, and that's totally normal. However, if it's painful, if it's a painful pop, then that's probably something to address. But if it doesn't cause you any pain, and this goes for really any popping, crackling, clicking, usually you're going to be totally fine. So just be mindful of whether it's painful or not. If it's not painful, don't worry about it. Continue staying consistent. And you might find as you get a little warmed up, maybe your first set, second set, third set, as you continue through the workout, it's probably going to reduce. But even if it doesn't, it's not something to worry about unless it hurts. Next question, how is life without eating sugar/junk? I train hard and perform well, but can't kick the junk food. Yeah, so I personally don't. I eat plenty of junk food myself. It's not like the main staples of my diet, but I absolutely eat junk food, what most people would consider junk food, every single day. I have in the past gone through periods of time where I eat like no junk food. I eat super clean, like bodybuilding bro style, and you do feel better psychologically. You do feel better physically. However, it is difficult to get, if you have a high calorie need, it's very difficult to get enough calories in from solely clean whole foods and not add anything else into it. And also, in most cases, depending on what you've got going on with your health, your goals, your body fat percentage, underlying issues, whether you have those or not, you don't need to eat 100% clean, quote unquote clean. And you can still be very healthy. You can still feel really well. And you also, as you are currently doing, like you stated in the question, you can perform really well. So a lot of the top athletes in the world, especially athletes that have a very, very high output calorie burn from their sport, from their training and so on, eat a lot of food that most people would not consider super healthy. And it is much better, in my opinion and in my experience, and really just kind of objectively, to be honest with you, it's a lot better to, if you have a high calorie need, to hit that high calorie need, even if some of that food, maybe 10% of it, maybe even 15% of it is less healthy, like more processed food, not quite what you'd see on the perimeter of grocery stores, like a lot of people say you should stick to. And most people should stick to the perimeter of grocery stores because most people don't have a high calorie demand, just being honest. But if you're listening to this and you train a lot and you are trying to eat perfectly clean, but you're struggling to hit your calories because clean food or whole food that's very nutrient dense is filling, it fills you up, it's satiating, it's hard to eat a lot of it, then you are kind of selling yourself short. I mean, of course, if your goal is just to eat healthy food and you don't really care about hitting your calorie needs and you are totally cool with, leaving some performance on the table, then that's one thing. But if you want to perform really well and you simply can't do it day after day, it's one thing to do this once in a while, but day after day after day, 7 days a week, 30 days a month, however many days a year that you want to hit this performance goal, it's really hard to do so on just whole food for a lot of people, not for everybody. Some people just have lower calorie needs or they have big ass appetites and they can eat a ton of food, even if it's mostly whole food. And that's great. If that's you, do it. But for a lot of people, including me, it's just not sustainable to do that. So I make sure typically that I save more like junk food, what most people would consider junk food or higher sugar food, for around training, usually right before, during training, because I'm literally just going to burn that through that and use it as fuel. And of course, there's a good type of food to consider for those times and not so great. You don't want to be eating a bunch of fat and oils and grease, but you can absolutely eat sugar. That is your body's preferred fuel source during high intensity training or long training or whatever it is. So that would be one time to eat it. Also, I save mine for in the evening when I'm done for the day. And usually when I eat that type of food, I don't feel great after. I don't feel like super energetic, like I want to go do a bunch of things and really think clearly. So I'll do it at the end of the day. And the next step for me that day is to wind down and go to bed. I try not to eat super fatty, sugary foods within about 2 hours of bedtime, just because it'll sit in my stomach, and eating shitty food right before you go to bed is not ideal for sleep. But I will save most of that to the evening. So I wouldn't worry too much about it unless, of course, you have another reason to reduce junk food, or unless you're just living off it, then I would definitely try and get back to eating mostly whole foods and kind of filling in the gaps with your favorite junk food. And you're probably going to feel better, perform better, look better, and be in better health if you were to do that. Next question about how many grams of fat do you eat daily? It's hard to keep fat under 100 grams a day for myself. Yeah, so on my high days, like my high carb days, I will eat around 90, sometimes 100 grams of carbs. I don't track, but I have a pretty good grasp on, I've tracked so much in the past. I've got a good grasp on what I'm eating, and I kind of keep a mental note. And on my high days, I usually eat around like about the same foods. And most of them are like pure carbs and protein, of course, like leaner protein. So on non-high days, like days where I'm either just doing one moderate workout or I'm taking a rest day, like today is a rest day, I don't really track or keep my carbs and fat like quite as rigid I will eat a little bit more fat on days like that. I'll eat a little bit less carbs and be totally fine with it. I'll still eat a good amount of carbs, and probably my fat doesn't go over like 120, 130 on most days, unless I'm like going out to eat or getting pizza or something like that. Then it's definitely inevitably going to go over. But for the most part, I still keep it relatively low, and low is always going to be relative, just depending on the person. However, most of my clients, when I start working with them, my nutrition clients, are eating significantly more fat than they need to be eating. A lot of people think like because fat is essential, and it is an essential nutrient, macronutrient, you need it. You don't need carbohydrates. But just because fat is essential, carbs aren't, doesn't mean you should eat more fat and less carbs, unless of course you're intentionally doing some sort of keto diet. That's one thing. But if you have like performance goals, you want to kind of keep that fat in check so you can push carbs higher. Protein isn't something that you want to like really detract from, even on no matter what. If it's a high output day, low output day, whatever, protein should be relatively constant. It can fluctuate a little bit if you're going crazy high in carbs. Like high carb intake, as well as being in a calorie surplus, is protein sparing. So you don't need as many grams of protein on days like that. But on the flip side, if you're in a calorie deficit and you want to keep your muscle as best you can, then you may want to take protein higher. You also may want to take carbs higher, and you may want to drop fat quite low. That way you perform well and you recover well. And honestly, just because you need a certain amount of fat, for most people, I would say a good sustainable amount of fat to take in per day is 0.35 to 0.4 grams per pound of body weight if you're a relatively lean, like under 20% body fat. But you can go lower than that for periods of time. Of course, you can go higher than that and be fine. But if you think that fat is, you have a mindset of, wow, fat is really good. Everyone says like, you got to make sure you're getting enough fat. First of all, almost nobody accidentally undereats fat. Very, very rarely. Tons and tons of people accidentally overeat fat, and therefore they overeat calories oftentimes. Second of all, just because you need a certain amount of fat, that doesn't mean more is better. Unless, of course, like I said, you're in a keto style diet or something like that, where you need higher fat because that's like the intent of the entire diet. So with my clients that struggle with the same thing, it's a little bit of a learning curve, and we have to identify. The main thing is like identifying foods that maybe you sneak in like 25, 30, 40 grams of fat without really even realizing it. Like, for example, if you're having 6 eggs in the morning, that's 40-ish grams of protein, but it's also 40-ish grams of fat. And you could do 2 to 3 eggs and then finish the rest off with egg whites, and you'd still get the benefits. Don't get me wrong. And if the yolk in eggs is very healthy for you, but also it's high in fat, and you're still getting the benefit if you cut that in half and then fill in the rest with egg whites. But egg whites are pure protein, and it's also less calories. So that's one very simple. Another one is a lot of people just naturally, when they go and get like, say, ground beef, they'll just get 85%. And although 85-15 sounds like, oh, that's mostly protein, less fat, when you look at the macros, you will learn that there's still quite a bit of fat in that. So other little things that sneak fat in, like eating out all the time, you just have no idea. Adding what you think is 1 serving of olive oil to cook, and it's 3 or 4. That's, olive oil is healthy fat, but it's also just adding fat and therefore calories to your day. And it's not like you're noticing that. That's just like a sneaky way to get it in. So beyond that, you want to identify which carb sources are either almost all or completely carbs. White rice, sourdough bread, rice and grinds, potatoes, sweet potatoes. Oats have a little bit of fat in them, but not that much. They're mostly carbohydrates. Fruit, mostly all carbohydrates. So as long as you're keeping your carbohydrate sources to foods that are mostly carbohydrates, and you are being mindful of what foods that you might be accidentally overeating fat in, and you're consistent with it, you just make small changes like that, and you have some foods on hand that are good ways to get your protein up. If you're falling short on protein, like a whey protein shake usually has maybe 1 or 2 grams of fat in it at the most. So, say you're 20 grams short on protein, and you could eat a steak, or you could have a protein shake that has almost no fat in it versus a ribeye steak that absolutely healthy, lots of nutrients, but also lots of fat in it. That way you can just go to the lean source. And the same with carbs. Have some backup carb sources on hand that have no fat in them in case you need to make up on carbs, but you don't want to eat a whole lot of fat for the rest of the day. So lots more that we could talk about on that one, but those should be some pretty solid starting points. Next question, does using the air runner throw off running technique and cadence compared to running on a track and road? Yeah, a little bit. If you're only using the air runner, then you're going to be a little bit, going outside and running is going to be a little bit of a novel stimulus. You can still improve your running on an air runner, but it is different enough that your cadence as well as just the mechanics of your running are going to be different. It's almost as if you are running on a slight uphill, probably 1% to 2% incline, but also because of the curved nature of it, it reduces the impact, which is a good thing if you're trying to get a good solid running stimulus, but also not subject yourself to like impact like you would on a road or something like that. But it is different enough that it's going to be a little bit of a switch. Now, if you're doing, say, 1 or 2 assault runner runs per week and you're doing 3 or 4 outdoor runs per week, totally fine. However, if you're training for something that's going to take place outdoors and you're doing most of your running on the assault runner, then you might be in for a little bit of a potential injury risk increase, as well as it's going to be a little bit of a running economy detractor when you get outside, because there's elements, there's terrain changes, different surfaces, and of course, a slightly different way to approach it, different techniques, different mechanics. So that would be how I would approach your assault runner versus outdoor running ratio. Next question, should you train any glycolytic pathway for SFAS greater than 10 seconds but under 120 seconds, 400 meter sprint, or Fran? Okay, don't do Fran. Fran is completely useless. Don't worry about doing Fran ever, but definitely totally unnecessary during SFAS prep. It's just not specific at all. And also it usually destroys people. And if you're going to go crush yourself in training for SFAS, do something that's more specific to SFAS, which is run, ruck, calisthenics, lift weights, carries, things like that. However, yes, you should absolutely train the glycolytic pathway. That is super important, especially because you're going to have to run throughout the first week, and a lot of that is going to be the glycolytic energy system. For those not aware, this is kind of the intermediate energy system. First energy system, short, low endurance, very high power, is the ATP PC or phosphocreatine energy system. Think of running a 80-yard sprint or doing a 1 rep max squat or jumping as high as you can or doing a very heavy Olympic lift. That is all ATP PC. The third one, the longest energy system that lasts forever, but it's very low power, is the oxidative or aerobic energy system. Think of just running at an aerobic zone 2 heart rate or zone 3 heart rate for a long period of time. Right in between there, glycolytic, basically glycolysis is required to produce ATP, and ATP is what is responsible for your work output. So glycolysis is essentially the breakdown of carbohydrates, the breakdown of glycogen or glucose. Glycogen is stored carbohydrates in your muscles as well as your liver, but in this case, the muscle glycogen is more applicable. And glucose is the same thing. It's just in your bloodstream. So it comes from like recently consumed carbohydrates. Both of them are very important. Glycogen is more of a stored long-term use energy source for your musculature. Glucose, and remember, glucose is what you get from recent carbohydrate intake or, taking gel packets during your run, drinking liquid carbohydrates, and so on and so forth. That is responsible for A, delaying how long it takes you to tap into your glycogen stores, B, kind of replacing a little bit of glycogen as you burn through it, and C, which almost nobody talks about, is glucose is your brain and your nervous system's preferred energy source. So in order to have a fully functioning nervous system, which, oh, by the way, is responsible for muscle contractions and producing work and movement and everything else that's required to perform at your best, you also want to have some circulating glucose in your bloodstream. So, and this really just goes for mostly higher intensity or glycolytic, which I'm about to get into, energy system training. So yes, 400 meter repeats are a staple, to be honest with you. 400s, 600s, 800s, whatever you want to do for repeats. I would do those most weeks, once a week. That is going to help you with your run times. You absolutely can do some longer intervals that are 5, 6, 7 minutes, more of like tempo style intervals, which may be kind of like teetering the line of zone 3 and zone 4, or glycolytic versus endurance. And by the way, all three energy systems are always going to be involved in all types of training, but you can bias one of the three by adjusting certain variables. So absolutely very important energy system to train. I would definitely do some repeats. And honestly, anytime you do a set of like 8 to 12 in the gym of an exercise, that's mostly glycolytic. If you've ever gone to the gym and you're either under fueled or you're under carbohydrate, like if you've ever tried low carb and noticed that your lifting sessions suck, it is probably because most general lifting rep ranges are glycolytic. So anything that takes anywhere between 15 seconds and 2 minutes to do your entire set, that's going to be mostly relying on the glycolytic energy system. So you absolutely want to train it, and you will be a lot better off when you do. And remember all of the things I just said about fuel and glycolysis and glycogen and glucose, and take those things seriously. I've talked extensively about fueling training in the past, but take that seriously. Next question. Would it be better to do 30 minutes of zone 2 3 times in one day, or 90 minutes of zone 2 once in one day? The latter would be significantly better for multiple different reasons. The magic of zone 2 aerobic training, all the benefits you get, the mitochondrial biogenesis or creation of bigger and more dense mitochondria, the increases in stroke volume from the heart, the ability to use fat for fuel, all are enhanced by longer single sessions spent in zone 2. And there's many more things that are also enhanced, like your ability to withstand impact, your mental toughness. As you get closer to the end, it gets more fatiguing, and lots of different factors as well. So if you had to choose, I would choose one long session over breaking multiple sessions in. Honestly, just to get like the fat burning benefits. And we're not talking about fat loss here. We're talking about how good your body is at using fat for fuel, which is a much longer lasting, almost infinite fuel source versus using carbohydrates for fuel, which is of course applicable sometimes if you're going fast, but if you're going really long, you want to be really good at using fat for fuel. And to get better at that, you have to go past the benefits start around 30 minutes. They really get good after 45 minutes. And the longer you go, basically, the better your body is, the more fuel economy you are training. The adaptations that you get are just going to improve your ability to use fat for fuel and kind of delay tapping into glycogen. So therefore, going longer is definitely a better option. However, if you have to choose, if you only have the option to do 3 30-minute sessions or even one 30-minute session, it is way better than nothing. It's not like when you go 30 minutes or even 20 minutes, it's useless. It's still beneficial, and you're much better off, instead of having that all or nothing thought process, either breaking them down into 2 sessions or even just doing 1 session and keeping it shorter. So like if you only have the option, you want to do 90 minutes of zone 2 once a week, say, and you only have the option to break it into 2 or 3 sessions, definitely do that. Don't think that it's a waste of time, because it's not. It's just not as good. There are certain cases where if you have, especially if you have really, really high run volume, a lot of runners do this, a lot of like high level runners do this, but usually we're talking like 70 plus miles per week, 80 plus miles per week. They will break their runs down into 2, because usually later in the run, you are more susceptible to injury just because you're mentally fatigued, you're physically fatigued, your joints are inflamed, and you're just more likely to start developing some issues with especially your lower body. So there are certain scenarios where breaking them into 2, but honestly, most elite runners who are doing this are doing like a 90-minute run in the morning and then maybe like a 30-minute run in the evening or a 40-minute run in the evening. So definitely better to go longer, but also not useless to go shorter. Really just depends on what you're going for as well as what your schedule allows. So hopefully that helps. Next question, will SOPC be enough, or should I look into train ups like yours to add once past OSUT? Good question. I have a lot of former clients that are kind of in this time frame right now. And so I'm kind of gathering information on what it's currently looking like, but it's always going to be different from the day you finish OSUT to the day you start SOPC. Everyone is going to have a slightly different experience depending on what your class is, but usually it's going to be a couple months, and they will absolutely put you through some PT you will do some required PT with the cadre. Basically, you'll be in SOPC hold. After airborne school, you'll be in SOPC hold for anywhere between 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, maybe even longer sometimes, depending on the time of year, depending on what's going on with the Q course. It's always different. So in that case, I would consider maybe equipping yourself with a program, but also maybe not following it to a T. This is when it kind of gets a little bit nuanced and there's some gray area. Because if you're trying to follow, say, my 2 and 5 mile run program, and also the cadre are taking you out for runs, that may be a little bit too much for some people. Or if you're trying to do Jack Gazelle and they're doing a couple runs a week and they're also doing some circuits or what they consider like CrossFit stuff. This was the case back when I went through. It could be different now, but that just makes it a little bit more complicated, and it'll make you have to be more reasonable and mindful of overdoing it. So I would say you could consider having the 2 and 5 mile program on hand. You can consider having SFAS program on hand. Maybe one of the Jack Gazelles. You could consider hopping on T850. The good thing about that would be if you hop on it for a few weeks and then you learn, okay, now we're about to start this stretch of time where they're basically going to be working us out several times per week. You can just hop off and you're not going to get charged for any time that you're not on it. So that would be another consideration. I usually send my dudes off to basic that I like prep. I coach up until they go to basic. I usually send them off with usually the 2 and 5 mile and SFAS. And I also just started to do some OSUT training plans for some of my clients who are parting ways with me, and plan on making a for the masses program for OSUT, like training during OSUT with minimal equipment. It's hard because everyone's going to have different access to different things, but it is something that's in the works as I gather more information and data on different experiences at OSUT. So is it 100% necessary? No, but would it potentially help, especially getting through like the unknowns or the periods of time where you just are in control of your own training? It could absolutely be, even if you don't follow it perfectly, or even if you say you hop on 2 and 5 mile for like 4 weeks and then all of a sudden they start to do more PT with you, or you do 2 and 5 mile throughout airborne school and then kind of make another determination a little bit later on. That could be a consideration, but it's really person dependent, depends on your strengths and weaknesses. And of course, depends on some factors that I don't know about and factors that are not in yours or my control. So best of luck. Next question, language training advice/strategies. Okay. So I went through language school back in 2014 or so, and it was 6 months long. I believe it's still 6 months for all languages. For a little while, some of the easier languages were a little bit shorter, but when I went through, it was 6 months for everyone, no matter what. And I got French. And the one time I ever got a 2.2, which is basically 1 point higher than the minimum required, which is a 1+1+ in order to graduate from the Q course, the language portion of the Q course, as well as in order to stay current throughout your career. That was the one time I got a 2.2, which is not really that surprising because you just get 6 months of continuous language training. And I honestly did not take it all that seriously, but I picked language up pretty easily. I'd have a really high D lab. I think it's the D lab that determines your propensity to learn language. Mine was pretty high. And for whatever reason, they gave me French, which is an easier language to learn. However, a lot of the easier languages to learn are harder to get high scores in. So for example, if you get a really shitty, difficult language like Mandarin or one of the Middle Eastern languages, whatever it is, Farsi, Dari, Pashto, those languages are much harder to learn, but in my experience and in a lot of people's experience, they're easier to get higher scores in if you apply yourself. And that would be my number one recommendation, is just apply yourself. Give yourself, 30, 45 minutes of studying every day, and you should be good to go. Of course, some people have a much tougher time with language learning than others. You might need more studying than that sometimes. Like if you have a test coming up or if you have your OPI coming up, you want to really practice a lot. But a lot of people make the mistake of just kind of coasting, either just during language or during language and also with their fitness. And that this is another thing I've talked about a million times. During language, you're going to have plenty of time to get fit and make sure you show up to group as fit as you possibly can. And a lot of guys don't take advantage of that. And it's really unfortunate because it's the best time of the Q course to take advantage of that, because you have a pretty predictable schedule and you might have to do some required PT. When I was there, if you got a certain PT score on the PT test, then you could just take periodic PT tests when everyone else did. But between that, you were on your own to train, which I think is how it should be. But I don't know if it's like that anymore. You might have to do some required PT. But either way, you'll have time to do your own PT as well, and you should. So apply yourself, build some sort of studying habit. It's not like going through SOCM, like the medical portion of the 18 Delta course, like the very beginning, that is a very high failure rate. I studied a hell of a lot more and worked a lot harder to get a worse grade in SOCM than I did in language. So it really depends on your language. It really depends on your propensity, your general propensity to learn languages and some other factors. But so long as you take it seriously, it's pretty damn hard to fail. Like you really have to do basically nothing and put no effort into it to not get a 1+1+ in pretty much any language. Of course, some are harder than others, but if you want to, you can definitely pass. Some guys don't. It's uncommon for guys to not pass language, but it's not unheard of. And most of the time, if not every single time, it's because they just don't care and they don't put any effort into it. And that's just not the type of person they're looking for in SOF anyway. So if you are a coaster or a check the blocker or just someone who does enough to get by, then I would probably check yourself and fix yourself and show up to language motivated, ready to crush. You will definitely lose motivation along the way. It definitely runs a lot longer than I think it needs to. I probably would have gotten the same score after 3 to 4 months as I did after 6 months. I don't think I got any better. I probably could have. I definitely could have if I applied myself more, but also I would rather just get it over with and test, but that's not really an option. So good luck with language and go smash it. Next question, most important question of the entire episode. What is your top uncrustable? My favorite uncrustable, I actually just started eating these, is the hazelnut ones. I'm pretty sure it's just Nutella that's in it, and it's freaking amazing. However, you can mess it up. So in order to make it perfect, you take it out of the freezer like 60 minutes prior to eating it. So it's maybe 75 minutes. It allows it to thaw out enough, but the bread is super soft and the inside, like the filling, is perfect consistency, like nice and soft and delicious. If you leave it out for like 10 hours, not the end of the world, but it's a little bit stale. If you don't leave it out quite long enough, the middle is still frozen. So the hazelnut ones don't need as much time to thaw out as the ones with peanut butter and jelly in them, which are also delicious. Don't get me wrong. But yeah, right now, definitely the hazelnut ones with a close second of strawberry jam, I would say. The honey ones are not my favorites. I would rather just make my own peanut butter and honey sandwich. I think it tastes better that way. But all the jelly ones are pretty delicious, but nothing beats the hazelnut, in my opinion. Next question. Hell yeah, this is a cool one. How should I go about adding the Manitou Incline and jumping rope into Jack Gazelle 2.0? So I wouldn't necessarily add them on top of what you're already doing with the program, but you can definitely you probably could add jumping rope, unless you're going crazy with jumping rope or you've never done it before, or you're just terrible at it and you don't know how to like land softly on the balls of your feet, whatever it is, then you could probably add 5 to 10 minutes of jumping rope basically every day if you want. Jumping rope is not super duper stressful. It's the decent thing to incorporate in your warm-ups or whatever have you. If you're doing like a 45-minute jump rope session, then yeah, you may want to sub that out with one of the conditioning sessions, whether it's one of the Metcons or the strongman session, or maybe even one of the runs, depending on what your goals are, then that would be consideration. But if it's just a little bit, you definitely can add that into a warm-up. I think multiple days I have pogo hops in the warm-up anyway, and pogo hops are pretty much jumping rope, but you're just jumping over a rope. So Manitou Incline, totally different story. However, it does depend on how you get back down. So going up the incline is an absolute, for those who don't know, you can Google search Manitou Incline in Manitou, Colorado. It's right outside Colorado Springs. I was stationed there for 4 years, and I used to do the incline at least twice a month, sometimes more. I did it a ton when I was prepping for the long walk. I would often do 2 back to back, and it was amazing, but it's brutal. It's, I think, 0.9 miles, but you gain like something like 2,000 feet or higher of elevation in that really short period of time. It's pretty much like I want to say it's like an old railway where they brought like items up the mountain. It's at the beginning of Pikes Peak, like kind of where Pikes Peak connects to Manitou, which is just a little town in Colorado Springs. And they put stairs on it. And they actually, when I was just getting there. They renovated it. And so the stairs are actually pretty legit. Like they're nice and well spaced out. There's some higher steps as you get higher, but it kind of starts a little bit less steep and then it gets crazy steep. And then there's a false summit, which is the most depressing thing ever. You think you're at the top and then you still have another couple 100 meters to go, which is a brutal one. Of course, once you've done it a couple times, you know that, but at first you don't. And the false summit just gets a lot of people. But anyway, it is brutal. It's very, very challenging. And I think like the record time was set by a guy named, what was his name? I can't remember his name. Basically, very, very good, great ultra runner that used to, I think he had like a 93, 94 VO2 max. For whatever reason, I can't think of his name, but he did it in like 16 minutes. And that is insane. My best time on it was like 26. A little over 26. And I used to do, when I did them back to back, my goal was to get under 30 on both of them, which I usually did. But needless to say, it's very, very brutal. However, because it's uphill and because you're stepping upstairs, it's low impact. And so it's not fatiguing. It's not a recovery burden. But depending on how you go back down, it can be. So what I used to do was jet bar trail is basically a trail that connects to the top of it and brings you back to the base, back to the parking lot. And it's about 5K, a little over 3 miles, but it's just downhill switchbacks the entire way down. It's super duper fun to gun down that thing. But because you're going downhill and if you go fast, then that is where the damage and the recovery requirements are going to come into play. So a lot of people think going uphill because it's so much harder than going downhill is more of a burden, harder to recover from, but it's the exact opposite. There's just so much more stress on the musculature, the connective tissue, the bones, and just the body in general to go downhill. So it's going to be more of a recovery burden. So if you're gunning down bar trail, not a big deal, but I would completely replace your Manitou incline session with a weekend run or even a tempo run or something like that. If you want to do it every single week, a little bit different, I would definitely need to look at, lots of different aspects of your recovery and how you're doing and what your goals are to give you some more specifics on that. But I would consider the incline, especially if you're running fast down it, I would replace that completely with a training session that's going to take about the same amount of time. And just know that if you are gunning down bar trail, you will definitely, if you do this every week, you will absolutely build these great adaptations to running downhill. And that's awesome. But the first few times you're going to be super sore and smoked, and it's going to be more of a recovery burden. So say you do that Saturday, you gun down bar trail and you have repeats and lower body lift on Monday. That's going to be a real struggle recovery wise. You're still going to be sore, most likely, if you go down fast. So if you're going up the incline and nice, easy walk down bar trail, totally different. Even if you do a nice, easy run, still a little bit more stressful, but not too bad. But it's not as fun that way, to be honest with you. So that is kind of how I would go about it. Jump rope, if it's in reasonable amounts, add a little bit. Manitou incline, I would definitely replace it with a long run or even a tempo run, especially if you're going hard. But just note that the first couple times you do it, especially if you gun down bar trail, it's going to be definitely a soreness inducing session. And it's also, if you rush back into training too quickly, you're putting yourself at slightly higher risk of injury than you would if you were on the weekend going out for a 75-minute zone 2 run. So have fun. Definitely jealous. Missed that place. And yeah, keep smashing. Next question. Any plans on programming geared for SFCDQC, which is dive school, combat diver qualification course? Maybe sometime in the future, but because that is a very niche school and it has low demand, and because water training is inherently dangerous, I am hesitant to make a program for the masses for people to go out and follow. The swimming portion, honestly, isn't that hard to train for. You could go to dive school and not be a great swimmer, but if you're comfortable in the water, especially underwater when you can't breathe, then you could pass. And I absolutely would not be able to give someone a underwater confidence program and feel confident that they're just going to go do it with a buddy. And, I would feel like if someone did that on my program, I would feel liable for it. So that is one of the reasons, as well as just not a lot of people go to dive school. And I usually try to make programs based on demand. Like common schools, courses, goals that people have. So it's not in the next couple of programs on the lineup, but it may happen at some point. But either way, it won't be a complete program. It'll be running based. Of course, you have to be a solid runner. You have to be able to crush a PT test, and you have to be good enough at swimming certain distances. So I could program that part. But the meat and potatoes of prepping for dive school is developing confidence in the water. And for that, you need certain people on hand. You need someone on the surface that can pull you out, hook you up to oxygen, hook you up to an AED if you pass out, aka like a lifeguard. And ideally, you have someone else in the water with you that is not going under and doing the same thing that you are, like a dive supervisor, in order to prep for that. So I would absolutely not be able to virtually program for that. Just absolutely not. And that's another big reason why I haven't done the program yet. But if you're going to dive school, those are the main things you should focus on. Of course, easier said than done, but there's pre-dive. And then hopefully if you're on a dive team, your team preps you really well for pre-dive and they have all the precautions in place. So, and that's really the main things that I would focus on in order to do well. Of course, if you're a terrible swimmer and you're useless in the water, then yeah, you want to focus on that as well. Or if you're a bad runner, you can't run 5 miles under 40 minutes, definitely work on your running. But for the most part, it's all about that confidence and the ability to not freak out and lose your mind when you are underwater, because I mean, that's what gets most people at dive school. Next question, should rep ranges for general strength be high or low? I need to be fit enough to pass PT tests. For strength, general strength, usually low to moderate. 1 to 6 rep range is what I would stick to most, but it does depend on what you're trying to get strong in. And a couple of other variables, like if you want a good mix of strength plus hypertrophy, then maybe 5 to 8 rep range, maybe up to 10. Certain lifts a little bit higher. But for brute strength, usually 1 to 5 rep range, maybe 6. And even more specifically, probably somewhere in the 2 to 4 rep range would be a good solid rep range for strength. So if you're trying to get a really strong squat, really strong deadlift, really strong bench press, really strong weighted chin up, whatever it is, you usually want to stick in that lower rep range. And you also don't want to be training. It's different than hypertrophy training in that you don't need to take these low rep sets to failure. You don't even have to take them within a rep of failure. Sometimes you can. Oftentimes, lower rep strength training will be programmed using percentages. I think there's a lot of nuances with percentages, so I rarely use it. I do have it in my Jack Gazelle program, but I always put ranges in there because your percentage is always going to be different based on your recovery and your preparedness and lots of other factors. But also I like RPE. If you're training in the 6.5 to 9 RPE range, most of the time in that 2 to 5 rep range, 2 to 4 rep range, adding weight to the bar over time, adding rep with the same weight, basic progressive overload, then you're going to get stronger. So unfortunately, there's some details missing. This is not on you or anything like that, but there's some details missing as far as general strength. I'm assuming since you want to pass a PT test, it's probably the deadlift, the hex bar deadlift, because that's the only real strength exercise on the PT test on the ACFT. But if it's a different PT test, then maybe I would have a different answer for you. But if it's that, I would hit hex bar deadlifts in that 2 to 4 rep range and add weight over time. No need to train to failure, but train pretty hard and you should be good to go. And eat enough, sleep enough, all that kind of outside the gym stuff. That's going to help. Next question, carb drinks versus solid carbs for early morning training. Is one better than other for energy output? For energy output, not necessarily. It does depend on what you're having for solid carbs though. So for example, if you're going early morning training, if you have like a high fiber source of carbohydrates, like a big bowl of oatmeal, like right before you train, then you're going to feel a little more sluggish than say if you had a bowl of rice and grinds, which is like no fiber, or if you had a liquid source. As far as if we're saying 1-to-1 liquid versus solid, both really good sources of carbohydrates for pre-workout training in the morning, it's personal preference, but it also kind of depends on what your workout is. If you're going for a run, for example, and you're eating 30 minutes before, 45 minutes before, 15 minutes before, I would consider mostly liquid or goo packets, some sort of goo or gummy or even candy. Honestly, even though eating candy wouldn't be the best way to start your day, it's still better than going in fasted, especially if you're doing something longer or higher intensity. and it's not that much worse than like a goo packet. It's pretty much the same thing. The sources of sugar are a little bit different, but concept remains. If you have, say, like an hour between when you eat and when you train, you can consider some solid stuff, even 45 minutes for some people. If you're going in lifting, then you can consider solid food. Usually, for most people, it's a little bit easier to go through a lift when you have actual food in your stomach, solid food in your stomach, so long as you're, following the general principles of peri-workout fueling that I've talked about any number of times. But it's really personal preference as far as what's going to fuel you better. It really is basically the same across the board. It really comes down to A, what you prefer, and B, what restricts your training or what hampers or interferes with your training the least. That's how I would go about making the decision. Next question, why do you feel minimalist boots are suboptimal for gated rucks? I would say they're suboptimal for a lot of people, but that doesn't mean if you have been using minimalist boots for a really long time and you're used to them and your feet are really tough, broken in, then you should be totally fine using minimalist boots. However, generally you're going to want a little bit more padding, especially if you're going hard, because training and daily life is a little bit different than testing. For testing, you're going to want the absolute best, safest, most effective option. And if minimalist footwear was better, then all of the best runners in the world would wear minimalist footwear, and they don't. And running and rucking are different, but they're not different enough to where that would not apply. You want a little bit more support. You want a little bit more protection between the ground and your feet, and something that's going to slightly reduce your injury risk a little bit more so that you can go fast and you don't have to think about all of the other different things that you have to think about with really thin soles or really minimalist boots. But like I said, if you've only used minimalist boots and you've practiced with them a lot and you've used them a ton, it probably is not going to make a difference. A ruck time trial is not quite the same as a run time trial because usually they're longer and usually you're mixing your speed. You're usually not like rucking at your absolute threshold like you would if you were doing a 5-mile run or a 7-mile run. Rucking is a little bit more variable. You're going to be in zone 3. You're going to be in zone 4 a little bit, most likely. So those little tiny details don't matter quite as much as they do with running. So even if the difference between you wearing regular boots and you wearing minimalist boots was a minute or 30 seconds in your 12-mile ruck, you probably would never know that because it's impossible to like mimic every condition every single time and separate the boot choice as the only variable. But that's the main reason why most people, when they start wearing minimalist stuff, they get hurt because they don't do it right. They don't ease into it properly. So a lot of people will start wearing them. They'll be like, I thought these were supposed to make my feet feel better, or I thought these were supposed to make my knees feel better, or I thought these were supposed to improve my gait. And they are, but not immediately. Right when you start wearing minimalist stuff, you are subject to a lot of different issues. And if you switch over completely, or if you just go too hard, or say you're running 30 miles a week in regular running shoes, and then you decide to run 30 miles a week in minimalist shoes, then of course you're going to hurt yourself because it's novel. It's your feet and your body are not used to the differences, the zero drop, the very thin sole where you have to really be locked in with your running form and your walking form and multiple different things that are potentially going to hurt you. So minimalist shoes are great, but I would highly consider choosing what's going to give you the most support and the most ability to put your absolute best time up. And for most people, that's not going to be a minimalist boot. If it is for you, great. But for most people, it's not. Next question, advice for slightly inflamed tendons in the ankle. I have a 12-mile ruck time trial left in the SFAS prep program, and I'm 12 days out from selection. Yeah, so honestly, the nature of selection prep is just that you're going to have some soft tissue and connective tissue inflammation. You just are. That's how it is. 12 days out is plenty of time to still do your taper. I'm assuming you are doing the ruck pretty soon, hopefully. And then you're going to do a good solid taper into selection where you really dial back, especially your training volume, a little bit, maybe your intensity. Definitely dial back your lifting. Keep running, at least touching on speed, doing strides, doing pickups, doing really short repeats, or repeats with really long rest periods so that you're still running fast, but you should be dropping your volume considerably. If you're on my program, it'll taper for you. But if you're not, then you want to consider that. I have a older, somewhat recent YouTube video where I talked about tapering. But honestly, once you finish the program and you start your taper, hopefully 8 days out, 9 days out, whatever it is, this should maybe not solve itself, but it should go away enough where it doesn't bother you anymore, or it's not a factor when you go into selection. But if you have some slightly inflamed tendons or slightly inflamed joints, or even just some things that are nagging you, just accept that as part of the process of prepping for selection. That's just how you're going to feel. A lot of people make the mistake of just busting through it and continuing to go and not doing any sort of taper. So they go into selection with all this inflammation without having allowed it to kind of subside by dialing it back beforehand. And that's not a good thing, because it's just going to get worse. But if you go in after a nice taper, even if you're feeling a little banged up now, still have plenty of time to not feel banged up as you go in. And it should kind of keep itself at bay for some of it. And then no matter what, once like land nav starts, maybe towards the end of land nav for some people, you're going to start feeling inflamed. Your entire lower body basically is going to feel inflamed almost all the time. That's just how it is. So this is one of the reasons why I don't recommend just prepping for selection, doing a selection prep program over and over and over again. Perpetual selection preppers, I've talked about this a lot in the past, but that is one reason. It's just not a very longevity friendly thing to do, to prepare for selection, which is also not very longevity friendly. But if you just do it once, or if you go to one other selection or whatever it is, maybe Ranger School, you're going to be okay. But if you're just prepping for selection over and over again, I know this wasn't the question, but I just want to kind of reiterate it. Not the best idea. So best of luck. And I would just take that taper seriously, get really good rest, get some really good nutrition, hydrate well, get your mind right. And I wouldn't worry too much about it. Next question: for the base phase of the 2 and 5 mile, do I follow the phase 1 strength component or the phase 2? Either one. You can follow phase 1 or you can follow phase 2. It's totally up to you. Depending on where you were at when you started, how long you've been on the base, it shouldn't be too much longer. But I think I have written in there that the recommended approach is to follow phase 1. But if you want to follow phase 2, that's totally fine. The lifting in phase 2 is lower volume, lower overall sets per week per muscle group, just because the running intensity and volume is a little bit higher. But either one is totally fine. If you prefer lifting 3 days a week, you can do phase 1. If you prefer 2 days a week, you can do phase 2, and you should be good to go regardless once the base phase is over. Next question: should I pair the 2 and 5 mile program with an upper lower split to increase size/strength and build a base? If you're following the meat and potatoes phase 1, phase 2 of the program, I would highly consider not adding anything to it and just following it as it's laid out. I know people are out there doing this, but you're going to get better results for running, which is hopefully why you're following the program, to get better at running, if you just follow the lifting as it's laid out. Additionally, the lifting is plenty to add a little bit of strength and size. It does depend on how much you're eating, what you're doing outside the gym, depends on your genetics, depends on if you're adding more things or subtracting things from the program or trying to play Tetris. But you absolutely can gain some muscle during it, even though it's not necessarily a hybrid program. Guys have gained muscle, especially if you're a little bit less experienced and you just have never really followed a structured program before. You absolutely should gain some strength and muscle. But even if you don't, it's still a 2 and 5 mile program. It's geared towards running. So don't be like upset if you don't gain strength. If you're more experienced, you might not gain any strength, but you should maintain it pretty decent. And the lifting is to support your running and make you more durable and a better runner. However, should you add an upper lower split to it? If you are following one of the phases, no. If you are in the base phase, which the question kind of sort of implies, then you could follow an upper lower split, so long as you're doing like the 4 day a week upper lower split, not upper lower 6 days a week. I think you should be totally fine. But honestly, it does depend on what your upper lower split looks like. If it's just ridiculous and the volume is astronomical, then that's not really going to help you whether you're running or not. The common issue that I see with a lot of people in the gym is not volume. They do plenty, if not too much volume. The common issue I see is intensity. The only reason a lot of people are able to do so much volume is because their intensity is lacking seriously. And coincidentally, volume in the gym is more fatiguing and therefore more of a recovery burden than training hard, training intensity. So if you are on a good solid upper lower split that has a reasonable amount of volume and you train hard and you're just doing the base phase, you should be fine. If you're doing something super crazy like 20 sets in a single session and you're doing that 4 days a week, then it's probably too much and you probably should dial it back or just follow, like I said on the last question, phase 1 lifting or phase 2 lifting, and you should be a lot better off that way. So it really depends, but generally, as a general statement for pretty much anyone listening, I usually don't recommend playing program Tetris or trying to combine 2 different programs or add your own flavor to anything. Fitness professionals, people who spend their lives coaching and studying fitness, struggle to take 2 programs, especially if one is lifting and one is conditioning, really struggle to take 2 programs and put them together in a way that's actually beneficial. So if you are not that, that should tell you that you're probably better off not doing that, because oftentimes it's going to either just be suboptimal, you're not going to make the gains you want to, or it can just run you into the ground, and we don't want that. So that's a little bit of my take on that question. Next question, zone 2 ruck training. Is it possible to stay in zone 2 at 13 minutes through 13:30 pace? Yeah, of course it is. I mean, it may not be for you right now, but at some point it absolutely will be. I have several clients that regularly ruck around that pace, and sometimes they don't even barely get into zone 2. Sometimes they're even below zone 2 if they're walking only. You will find that if you continue to build your aerobic base and you continue to build your rucking ability in particular, that you're going to be able to go faster at lower heart rates, or you're going to just be able to go faster and your heart rate will go high too, but you're just going to get better. Just like anything, you're going to get better. Like, for example, a lot of people are running 11-minute miles in zone 2, and it may be crazy to think that there are some high level runners out there that can be in zone 2 at like 6:30 miles, but it is possible. You just have to get more fit. And of course, not everyone's going to get there, but the more often you do it, the fitter you get, the better you'll be able to stay in certain zones for certain paces. And this is very, very possible. Just takes a little bit more fitness. So keep at it. Next question, which program do you suggest running prior to the Q course? I am 6 to 8 weeks out roughly. 3, 4, I've got 4 options that can work pretty well for you. The first 3 are my 3 hybrid programs, Jack Gazelle 2.0, and T850. All pretty solid options. If you want to go back and listen to the last episode, I talked about the differences between Jack Gazelle 1 and 2. And T850 is pretty similar to Jack Gazelle 2. However, because I update a new block every 6 weeks, the phases are always changing. Basically, every 6 weeks, you'll see a new block. So some of the phases will look similar to Jack Gazelle. Some will look similar to Jack Gazelle version 2. Some of them will look a little bit different than both of them. And that's obviously a subscription program. So if you were to do that, you could hop on and then you could hop off once the Q course started and you're not really in control. However, I do have guys that are in the Q course that are on T850. And of course, they have to make some small adjustments. And there's a chat feature in T850. So if you want like specific adjustment recommendations, you can hit me up in the chat if you're on that program. But you could also just follow it till you go and then kind of see what the Q course is thrown at you. I've got a couple clients that are in the Q course too. But Jack Gazelle 2 or 1 would also be good options. Those are just one-time purchase programs. You follow them straight through. And then if you feel like you're struggling with your running and you really want to smash the run when you start, and you're also looking to maintain your general army fitness, your general strength, then 2 and 5 mile would be a good option. But you will get better at running on those other programs. They're just not as run biased. So any of those would be solid options. All right, we will do 2 more questions. What is your opinion on the 5x5 man maker? So for those who are not aware, the 5x5 is 5 mile ruck with, I think, 45 or 55 pounds. I think actually the ruck is kind of up to you based on your fitness levels. Then you do immediately 100 squats with the ruck. Then you drop the ruck and you do a 5 mile run. And then you finish with 100 air squats. So 10 total miles on foot. 5 of them rucking, 5 of them running, and then 200 squats, 100 with a ruck on, 100 without. So obviously pretty brutal, tough training session. I personally use this as like a benchmark for some of my clients to do very periodically. I don't think it's very specific in the sense of doing it every week or doing it multiple times per week in order to get better at running, rucking, or both. You are going to make better progress if most of the time you train running to get better at running and you train rucking to get better at rucking. Also, it is going to be less fatiguing and easier to recover from that way. And, you do most of your lower body lifting in the gym, like actual progressive overload and so on and so forth with weights. So I really like to use it as a benchmark to kind of test progress, like how far we've come. Some of my clients, we do this maybe every 10 weeks, maybe every 12 weeks. Some clients, I don't have them do it, but it really just depends on the person. It depends on lots of different factors, how much rucking beats you up, how little it beats you up, where you're at in your journey, whether you need to even be ruck running or going really fast with a ruck on right now or not, and many other different factors. I do, however, quite often have guys do ruck run bricks minus the air squats and with parameters for the runs and the rucks, like intensity parameters, like, hey, you're going to go 75-minute ruck followed by a 35-minute run. The ruck, every 10 minutes, you can run or trot 2 to 3 out of those 10 minutes. And then during the run, high zone 2, low zone 3. Or sometimes I'll have guys do the ruck and then, hey, go and burn it down on the run. But that's usually going into a week of reduced volume, going into sort of a deload week or some extra days off, just because that's hard to recover from. And also, if you're doing it just for training, it's very difficult to measurably make progress. You just can't look at it and be like, how is this getting me better? Because it's not really being done at a specific intensity, pace with intent. It's usually just go do this as fast as you can. So basically you're giving yourself a time trial multiple times per week. Now, if you make some adjustments to it and you give yourself some parameters, then it can be great. Like I said, I do run ruck bricks all the time. Brick is just a triathlon term where people will do a bike ride followed by a run to mimic how they're going to feel during their triathlon when they hop off the bike and they go into their run to finish off. And I use that for ruck run because it allows you to train both. It allows you to get used to running on fatigued legs, which is very important. But if you throw some parameters in, like, hey, during the 5-mile ruck, you can basically trot every 2.5 miles and then walk 2.5 and then trot 0.25, trot 2.5 and so on and so forth. So you're basically trotting half of it and you're walking the other half. And that's just an example. If you haven't been ruck running or you have no need to ruck run, like you don't have a selection coming up, then there's no need to ruck run. But that could be one example. And then maybe no squats at the end. You got 5 minutes to change into your running shoes, hydrate, fuel, and then go out for your run. And during your run, stay in zone 2 until the last 10 minutes. And then you can kind of go up to like an RPE 8 to finish it off, tempo. That would be, and then no squats at the end because we're doing squats. We're doing our gym stuff in the weight room on separate days or another time that day. And it's just more focused on that. So that's kind of the way I would approach it. Has 5x5 worked for a lot of people that do it frequently? Of course it has. It's not going to make you worse, but I don't think it's the best thing to do consistently on a regular basis with like no parameters, no intensity parameters in order to get as good as you possibly can at rucking and running. So hopefully that makes sense. Next question. Do you recommend or have any experience with loaded stretching? Lifting weights with a full range of motion is the best way to do loaded stretches. So yes, I do. Basically every time I lift, I use full range of motion. And so every movement, every rep of every set is a loaded stretch. Is it getting into the end range for every single muscle? No. But if you want to improve your mobility, talked about this quite a lot in the last episode. If you want to improve your mobility in a way that is a lot more time efficient and also more effective, lift weights with a full range of motion, sometimes maybe even an exaggerated range of motion. And that is by far the best way to do it. There are other ways to loaded stretch and it can be totally fine, but I don't really recommend beyond lifting weights going about some crazy loaded stretching protocol, unless of course your job or whatever your sport of choice involves a lot of loaded stretching, which I can't really think of any off the top of my head, but there definitely are some. But I would tread carefully with it, unless of course you're just doing full range of motion lifting, then send it. Next question, is it okay to only deadlift with the trap bar for selection prep? Absolutely. I would recommend this to more people than I would recommend doing straight bar deadlifts for selection prep. Most of my clients in the last 3 months, last 2 months at least, sometimes last 3 months, all they do for deadlifts is Romanian deadlifts usually with dumbbells, and trap bar deadlifts for like their actual deadlift movement. I try to limit the spinal loading that my guys get in the gym because we get a lot of spinal loading elsewhere with carries and rucks. That doesn't mean none of them do any back squats or any deadlifts or anything like that, but we try and keep it to just the bare minimum in order to continue to maintain that adaptation, but not necessarily add excess fatigue. And the trap bar deadlift is just a lot more doable for a lot more people than the straight bar deadlift. And it's generally, in my experience, as well as the experience of almost everyone else who coaches people in fitness, it's just a less injury potentially promoting lift than the straight bar deadlift. That being said, if you are a really good deadlifter with a straight bar, conventional, or whatever your preferred stance is, and it works well for you, then absolutely do it. Totally fine. I wouldn't really be cranking heavy deadlifts like 1 week out, 2 weeks out, but you definitely can deadlift. I deadlift every single week, and one of my main goals is to not hurt myself, yet I still pull 500, sometimes a little bit more every week. And that's just what I do. I'm confident in the fact that I can do it properly enough and be mindful enough and listen to my body enough to where I'm not going to put myself in a situation where I hurt myself. But I've also been deadlifting very consistently with a lot of intent for decades. So I feel super comfortable with it. I'm also built well for deadlifting. Not everybody is. And if you feel like the deadlift with a straight bar beats you up and you still want to do a deadlift movement, absolutely, I would do the hex bar. In fact, selection prep or not, if the hex bar deadlift feels better for you and you enjoy it, then just do that. There's no rule that's saying you have to deadlift with a straight bar, unless of course you're a power lifter or maybe a strongman competitor or some other sport that involves it, maybe a CrossFitter. But aside from that, no one has to. And there's every lift that applies to every single lift. You don't have to do a lift if it bothers you, and you're better off not doing that lift or making that lift a better fit for you by working on your technique, working on your mobility, whatever it is. But in most cases, it's usually just more practical to switch it out. All right, we will make this the last question. And it's one that I am very passionate about. So if you could develop the perfect sleep hygiene routine for those prepping for SOF, what would it look like? Okay, so there's a million things that could potentially go into this, but I'm going to talk about just a few things that are by far the most impactful on sleep. Number one is consistency, going to bed and waking up at the same time as much as you possibly can. If that's every night, great. If it's almost every night, still good. If it's different every single week, you stay up way later on weekends, you sleep in on weekends, and you get up early and go to bed early on weekdays, you're throwing yourself off every single week. You're giving yourself jet lag. So say normally you go to bed at 9, you wake up at 5 during the week. Say on weekends, you go to bed at midnight and you wake up at 7 or 8. Every single week, you're basically flying to the West Coast and then back to the East Coast on the weekend. And anyone who's done that before, of course, it's not as bad as like flying overseas, but you still feel a little bit of a jet lag. And you're doing that every single weekend by staying up late and sleeping in on weekends if you do that. So that's by far number one. That is going to be the most impactful on your sleep quality. And again, you don't have to do it every night, but every night you're in control of your sleep and wake. If there's one time to do this and really dial it in, it should be the last couple months before you go to selection. Number two is actually starting in the morning, getting outside and exposing yourself to the outdoors. If it's sunny out, that's the best case scenario. If it's not sunny out, you can stay out a little bit longer and you still get that benefit. Essentially, when you go outside, you expose your eyes especially, but if it's nicer weather, you can also expose your skin, which helps even more. You expose that to the sun. You don't have to stare at the sun, but just be outside, no sunglasses on, at least this part of the day. That is going to pretty much tell your body we're all in this like circadian clock. It's a biological clock. It's not something that you can just decide to turn on and off other than your actions and what you do throughout the day and in the evening. But it basically tells your clock that, hey, it's morning, which means later today, it's going to be night and I'm going to fall asleep at that time. It pretty much gets you regulated, gets your circadian rhythm regulated. So that'd be number two. Number three is some sort of pre-bed routine. I usually recommend a night alarm. So you set an alarm approximately 1 hour before you want to go to bed. This should be the same time every night because what I talked about earlier, by the way, The consistency can be like within like a 30-minute window. It does not have to be the exact same second every single night. If you're anytime within a 30-minute window, you're good to go, maybe even 45, just to clarify that. But you set a night alarm an hour before you want to go to bed. That is your cue to plug your phone in and stop thinking about it. Stop looking at it. Looking at your phone before bed, anytime within like 30 minutes before bed, is going to detract from your sleep for many, many different reasons that I've got into in the past. But basically a combination of what you're looking at and the stress response that gives, as well as the fact that it's emitting blue light, and blue light interferes with melatonin production. Melatonin is very important for you to fall asleep. So that alarm goes off. You either take a shower, maybe prep your food for tomorrow, maybe prep your gear for tomorrow. Maybe you pet your dog. Maybe you have a conversation with your spouse. Maybe you listen to something. You can definitely listen to a podcast or listen to maybe like a story on Spotify or whatever it is. You could listen to an audiobook. Ideally, what I recommend is reading an actual book. It's kind of a foreign concept to a lot of people, but I recommend reading a book. This usually just puts me right out. I get to bed about 20 to 30 minutes before I want to fall asleep. And oftentimes after 10 minutes of reading, sometimes even sooner than that, I'm ready to go to sleep. So what I would recommend is not reading something that's like very engaging. Like I wouldn't read a self-help book or a nonfiction book that's like really makes you think and you have to like implement a lot of things from the book. I would read something that's either like a biography or a true story, like a historic true story, or some kind of novel that is entertaining, but not something that like makes you think a lot and like gets your brain juices going. Like, oh, wow, I got to go implement this. No, that's not the time to do it. You want to do something that's calming before bed. You can do a stretching routine. You can take a nice warm shower. I wouldn't go crazy hot. I wouldn't go crazy cold. Basically, if you take a warm shower and you get out into the ambient air, it's going to drop your body temperature a little bit, especially if another thing that you should do probably before this, but at least within that last hour, is turn your thermostat down to the 64 to 68 range so that the ambient temperature is lower. So your core temperature can drop before you go to sleep. It's literally required to get into a deep sleep for your body temperature to drop. And a lot of people just sleep with their house on like 75 and they wonder why they don't get quality sleep. And that is definitely one big factor. But if you take that warm shower, you get out into that air, it's going to kind of get the ball rolling on dropping your core temperature and therefore enhance your sleep. So any number of different things you can do besides basically watching TV, working, checking email, looking at your phone is going to be a really good thing compared to what most people do in the evening. So lots of different other things that you can consider. Definitely consider cutting off caffeine early. Don't be boozing in the evening. That's going to fuck your sleep up. Maybe have some sort of journal next to your bed where if you're thinking about a lot of things or if you're anxious or stressed or worried, you can write down your thoughts before you go to bed. I have a journal right next to my bed that I do exactly that with, and it helps quite a bit. Believe it or not, just getting it out of your head and on paper is really, really effective. But if you can do those three things, honestly, if you could just do that one thing where you go to bed and wake up around the same time, granted, that's the hardest one for most people to do, but it's also by far the most effective. You can just do that one thing, you're going to be setting yourself up for success. And really anything else is a kind of a cherry on top. So that would be my down and dirty sleep hygiene recommendations for anyone, really, whether you're prepping for SOF or not, but especially last few months before you go to selection, I would really, really take that seriously. And it's going to benefit you in many, many different ways, both acutely day to day, as well as in the future, because it's going to help you recover and progress the way that you should. And you're going to show up well prepared for selection. So that's it, guys. We'll cap it there. Thank you very much for listening. I definitely think I got through quite a few questions today compared to usual, but if you're still here, greatly appreciate you. And I will be back soon with another episode. Until then, Terminator out.